get my recording going here. Let's talk about the effects of the war, whatever it is. The French and Indian War was a decisive victory for the British, okay? But it's going to have some negative effects on them. We know that England picked up a lot of land, vast amounts. They were the big winner. France was the big loser. Spain was kind of a wash, right? But it also picked up a great deal of debt and had a lot of issues with how it dealt with the colonies because of this. So the effects of the war on the American colonists. First off, it united them against a common enemy for the first time. That's going to be important to us because for the first time, colonists are going to start thinking of themselves as Americans and not as Virginians or Massachusetts or New Hampshireans or Connecticutans. They're going to be thinking of themselves as something larger. And that's because they were forced to cooperate against what they saw as an invading enemy, France. In fact, it wasn't an invading enemy. France was there first, and the Indians even before that, but they saw it as an invading enemy. Second, we created what we call a socializing experiment, or a socializing experience for people. Now, you might not know what that means, but every generation needs a socializing experience. It's something that a generation shares, that links them intrinsically forever. It makes them feel as if they're part of something larger. I think about, for my parents' generation, it would have been the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You ask anybody that generation, where were you? They can tell you exactly where they were. For my generation growing up, it was when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. For the millennials, it's going to be 9/11. That's going to be their socializing experience. I don't know what y'all's socializing experience is going to be. For these guys, the socializing experience was this war, this violent war against the French and the Indians. Now, finally, it creates bitter feelings between the British and the colonists that are only going to intensify. If you remember back, there was a chart that we had up there where we compared colonials with British. And I showed you the different styles of warfare. That way the British would march out there and they'd get in their lines and they would fire in 3 ranks with this massive amount of lead going down range. And they would stand there heroically, some would say heroically, some would say stupidly. They stand there in the middle of the field and just shoot at each other until somebody surrenders. While the Americans, we used guerrilla warfare. We hid behind rocks and trees, shot at you, and then ran away. Well, that's going to be divisive because the British are always going to try and get the American militia to stand in ranks and fire like the British did. And time and again, the militia would collapse. They couldn't stand there with the discipline that the British regulars did. That's going to create a lot of hostility between the two. All right. Let's talk about the aftermath of this war. We oftentimes think that because the French surrendered, the French and Indian War was over. Well, I'll tell you, most textbooks say that. Most textbooks list the end of the war as when the French surrendered. Those people also forget that it was the French and Indian War. Just because the French surrendered does not mean the Indians did. And some of the Indians did not surrender. In fact, this guy, Chief Pontiac, refused to surrender. Chief Pontiac was a leader of a very militant tribe up in Michigan, which would be appropriate when you think about it. The Pontiac car is made in Michigan. It's named after him. Or was. I don't think they make Pontiacs anymore. But back in 1763, Pontiac refuses to surrender. And he decides to take his fight on to the British. And he's been pretty successful. He's been fighting next to the French and been very successful against the British. But what he doesn't count on is, with the French gone, and that war over, the British no longer have to divide their forces. And instead, they mass their forces against this one rebellion, and they put it down very quickly. The ones that were not killed were imprisoned at a place called Fort Detroit. And then the British decided to give them gifts. And in typical British style, they give them gifts of blankets, but the blankets came from smallpox hospitals. Why would you do that? Because it's the intentional extermination of the Indians.
It's kind of smart.
It is cheaper to do that than it is to send men in. And it was a way of exterminating them and not having to care for them. Okay? This is not a high point in morality among mankind. Okay? We were a very vicious people. And this kind of puts down the Indian side of the battle. You kind of want to know how big it is. You can see where all the battles happen. The attacks happen all those places where you see the bright red flashes there. So all across the Great Lakes area, mostly around Lake Erie and Lake Michigan. Okay? All right. I want to talk about the backlash that happens here. The French and Indian War was a success. And America got this vast amount of land. And we were proud of getting this land. We had fought hard next to our British allies to capture this. And all of a sudden, the colonists had this dream of pushing all into that the old French area out there and settling the Great Plains, settling that whole region. But the British, they're tired of fighting. And they're tired of paying for it. So what do? Well, they establish a proclamation line. It's called the Proclamation of 1763, or the Proclamation Line. And you can kind of see it there. It's that green line there. It's got the red arrows pointing to it. It starts up at the northern end of the colonies. It stretches all the way down into Spanish Florida, and it basically goes along the Allegheny and Appalachian Mountains. Okay? Now, what they did is they told these colonists that they would not be allowed to settle west of the Proclamation Line. That's going to be important. That's going to be a term on your next test. So make sure you know what the Proclamation Line was. The colonists were not allowed to settle west of the Proclamation Line. Why are they not allowed to settle west of it? That's where the Indians are. And the thought was, if we just keep the colonists from spreading out there, we won't have to continuously fight the Indians for more and more land. Well, there's problems with that. I want you to imagine for a minute that you are an American colonist and you yourself fought in the French and Indian War. Or maybe your father or your brother or your son fought in the French and Indian War, and maybe they died. Now, you believe this war has been fought and your family has shed blood in order to have that land, and the king says, yes, we captured that land, but you can't use it. How mad are you? I don't know about you, I'd be furious. Why did we do this? Why did we fight this terrible, awful war if when it's over with, we don't even get to enjoy the treasures of it?
Where did you say the line was?
It's stretched across the Allegheny and Appalachian Mountains. Good question. So this is going to be another division point between the colonists and the mother country. We're going to talk about these in a lot more detail a little later on. Let's at least get introduced to them. George Grenville comes to power. I will tell you that his name, you'll sometimes see it spelled with one E and sometimes two. Usually textbook, I think your textbook spells it Greenville with two E's. It's always pronounced Grenville, okay? Whether it's got one E or two E's, it's always pronounced Grenville. Lord Grenville was put in charge of the colonies. And Grenville has no respect for the colonies. He kind of sees American colonists as England's stupid redneck cousins. Okay? In fact, the nickname he gave was our backwoods brethren. Okay? Some of us still feel like that sometimes, as backwards brethren of other people. Sounds like it just describes my family as a whole. I always say if there's an Albert's family reunion, there's going to be a 12-step program in Kmart somewhere. But,
Sounds like Will's.
yeah. But Grenville wants to pay for the war. And he believes that the American colonists benefited the most from it, since it happened here, and they should pay for their share of the war. So he starts finding ways to pay for it. And he starts finding ways to enforce those laws. So he passes 3 absolutely hated laws. The first is an easy one to understand, the Sugar Act. 1764. This is just a tax on sugar. By the way, if you haven't figured it out yet, all an act is, it's a law, okay? An act is another word for a law. So the Sugar Act put a heavy tax on sugar. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but if you know anybody, any of the British were, they still are, quite fond of their sugar. They put sugar in everything. If you ever go to England, everything has sugar in it. Sugar on their rice, sugar on their meat has got sugar on it. Everything does. So this was a really big tax. Americans hated it. The next big thing is we needed people to enforce this tax. So in 1765, they passed the Quartering Act. Now the root word to remember this is quarters. What do we mean by your quarters? It's where you live, right? You're told to go to your quarters, you go to where you live. It's a military thing. But it's kind of the idea here. Well, the Quartering Act required you to quarter soldiers in your home. You need to know that because it's on your test. The Quartering Act required you to house soldiers or quarter soldiers in your home. Literally, they would show up, knock at your door, and you'd open the door. There's a redcoat there, you know, lobster back, whatever you want to call it, this British soldier, and he says, "Congratulations, this young lieutenant is going to be living with you now." And you were responsible for giving them housing and providing their basic needs. You're providing their food, their lodging, everything. Instead of building barracks, this is how the British dealt with the problem. What's the problem with that? It is weird, and a lot of them, not by no means a majority. I think a majority of them probably acted responsibly, but enough of them stole from people. In some cases, raped wives and raped daughters. Enough of that happened that the colonists felt like they were betrayed.
That was the first thing I thought of. Well, not first thing, but.
And beyond that, even if they didn't, even if they show up and they behave perfectly proper, it's pretty expensive to add another dependent onto somebody, right? All of a sudden.
Would they stay usually just until the war was over?
Usually a few months. Yeah, a few months they would stay with you. So we hated it. By the way, just I know my class here at Wells has heard the story before, but the rest of you haven't. A future president, a young man named Andrew Jackson, he was a young boy at the time of the American Revolution, a boy of 6, 7, 8 years old, very, very young. And according to the story, if you ever look at a picture of Jackson, he has a scar on his cheek. And that's because he stepped in to defend his mother's honor and was swiped across the face as a 7 or 8 year old boy with the flat end of the sword. And it split his cheek up here. As a result, Jackson's going to spend the rest of his life hating the British, and they're going to learn to regret that little decision, because Jackson's going to beat them all in 1812. But at this time period, that's what's happening. Okay, so we hated the Quartering Act, and then there was the most hated act of all, the Stamp Act. If there was one law that was the single most responsible thing for Americans breaking with England, it was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required that a stamp be placed on legal documents and playing cards for some reason. And that was always added on it. But think about it, a stamp that has to be placed on legal documents. Now don't think of a stamp like a postage stamp. Think of this as like a wax involved. You've got to get that wax signet ring put on there. It's a stamp from the government. Think of it like a notary public stamp. All right? Think about the things that have to be stamped. Playing cards, newspapers had to be stamped, and then all legal documents. So if you get married, you got to have a stamp. If you graduate, your diploma has to have a stamp. If you sell property, it has to have a stamp. Any legal deal that you do has to have a stamp.
What was the wrong with getting stamps though?
Well, here's the problem.
We'll have to pay
You had to pay for the stamp, and that was a tax. And there was a great big tax on that. So all of these everyday items that you did, you're paying a tax on. And it became a very expensive way to tax. Now, do we still have a stamp tax?
Yes.
I got news for you, we do. We just don't know it. People don't realize it. When you get your diploma, y'all are mostly juniors. When y'all graduate high school, you're gonna get your diploma. And at the bottom of it, there's gonna be a little gold embossed seal that says the state of Texas and whatever your school district is. What do you think that stamp is? You're not paying the tax directly, but the property taxes you collect go to that. How about when you have to go to a notary public to get something signed? You have to pay the notary public to do it. That's stamp tax. We still have this, okay? Driver's license, yeah. They got that little embossment on it. Yeah, sure. But think about that. We went to war over this. No taxation without, we went to war over this. And we have it today. And we have it today. Okay? All right. I want to talk to you a little bit about the idea of taxation without representation. Because I know we've all heard that. I just yelled it right here in the room a minute ago. No taxation without representation. That was the battle cry of the revolution. Except, was it really true that we weren't represented? Well, there's a problem with this. If you were an American citizen, if you were an American today, you would say, no, we weren't represented. Because we did not get to vote for our representatives. Americans did not get to vote for a member of parliament, period. It wasn't there. You didn't get to do it. Every member of parliament was elected by people in England. So, as an American, we would say we aren't represented. Because in our system of government, our congressman, we have direct representation. Our congressman directly represents us. We elect our congressman, he lives in our district, and he goes on to Washington and theoretically represents us, unless you live in this district. But that's not the way the English see it. The English believe in something called indirect or limited representation. The idea of they believe that every member of parliament represents every member of the British Empire. So even if you are elected by somebody in England, that representative does not owe his allegiance to the people that elected him. He owes his allegiance to every member of the empire, and he votes in that way. Well, if that's the way you see it, we were represented. We were represented by all of Parliament. So when you think about this, it's just a different way of looking at it. Still today, that's true, by the way. In England, they would not understand the idea of direct representation at all. They don't believe in that. They believe in virtual representation. Here's the other thing. Does the Parliament really even have authority over the colonies? There was some question about that. The king had in many cases had given royal governors absolute power. So why are we complaining about what Parliament does? Well, Parliament's passing taxes and we don't like that. Parliament's also not considering American ideas. So what do we end up doing? let's look at that for a minute, see if we can figure out what we get. First thing we do is we start protesting. Americans are really good at protesting. We like to protest. Most famous protest group ever, I don't care what they say, Black Lives Matter, what was it, Occupy Wall Street, all these Bureau of Land Management, all these different protest groups that are out there, none of them can compare with these guys. These are the Sons of Liberty. Sons of Liberty actually begin in New York City. They're going to reach their height in Boston, but they started in New York City with the cousin of future President John Adams, a guy named Samuel Adams, the one the beer company's named after. He was not the founder of that company, but he was a brewer, and he was a good person for a beer company to name something after him. Sam Adams organized this group of patriots, called them the Sons of Liberty, and they had regular meetings. And he made one really smart decision, holding his meetings in a bar. Why is that a smart decision?
Get everybody drunk.
Because you could talk a drunk person into doing anything, okay? And he would show up, and we call it a firebrand. He would show up, and he would start complaining about all the terrible things the British were doing. And he'd buy a round of drinks. Then he'd complain some more, and he'd buy another round of drinks. And after about the third or fourth round of drinks, he's no longer going person to person and complaining. Sam Adams is now standing on the bar yelling, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Are you with me?" And all the drunks say yes. Okay? And he organizes these people, and they go off to do what we call the Stamp Act riots. Now, you want to talk about rioting? These guys took it to an extreme. They went out in the streets of first New York and later Boston, and they burned the tax collector's house to the ground. Okay? This is a picture of them burning the tax collector's house. This is the way you got treated in New York if Sam Adams went against you. By the way, in the interest of fairness, I'm going to tell you the rest of the story that history books don't ever tell you. There's more to this than just Sam Adams being a great patriot. While I believe he was a great patriot, he was also a smuggler. He was bringing in tea illegally, and by leading these riots, he was basically sometimes taking out rivals and always taking out the person that was most responsible for inspecting his ships and collecting the tax duties. So there was at least a little bit of self-preservation. All right, so this momentum against the Stamp Act is so big that in 1765, the Stamp Act Congress is called. Delegates from every state except one. There was one state that didn't show up. Anybody hazard to guess which state it was?
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, the one that never shows up to anything, right? The traditional home of the otherwise minded. Rhode Island doesn't show. The rest do. And at the Stamp Act Congress, they passed the Stamp Act resolves where they agree that they're not going to pay the tax. They're just going to violate the law. We're going to do gentleman trades with our legal deals and just not file them with the government. We're going to make our own playing cards. We're going to illegally publish newspapers. We're just not going to pay it. Period. And it worked for a little while. So, what does Parliament do? Well, Parliament kind of outsmarts us. I hate to say that. It bothers me to say that Parliament outsmarted the colonists. By the way, they didn't outsmart Sam Adams. Sam Adams saw through it immediately. But they passed something called the Declaratory Act. Now, with the Declaratory Act, they agreed to repeal both the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. They repealed it, which is what the colonists wanted. They said, fine, you're right. Parliament says, fine, I understand, I hear you, we're going to repeal it. But they put a clause in there that declared that the colonies were subordinate to Parliament in all affairs. Now, why is this a smart thing to do? Well, because the colonists are so happy they won this victory over the hated tax that they accept the law. And by accepting the law, what have they also accepted? They've accepted that Parliament is their boss. Something that they had been denying up to this point. Up to this point, they've been saying, this tax is not justified because Parliament has no right to tax us. Carson's yanking the microphone down for us. They were saying that Parliament has no right to tax us. But now, by accepting this, they're saying, yes, Parliament is our boss. And Sam Adams warns them, don't accept this, don't accept this. But people were so happy for the tax break, they just kind of accepted it. And it's going to bite us in the butt a little later on. All right, so in comes this guy, Charles Townshend. Charles Townshend replaces Grenville as the person in charge of the tax policy. He comes in along with a guy named William Pitt. William Pitt at this time is the Prime Minister, while Charles Townshend is the Secretary of the Exchequer. If you don't know what that is, an exchequer is a tax collector. And he says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get rid of those taxes that you don't like. Instead, he puts in some other taxes that are hidden. Y'all know what a hidden tax is?
Can't see it.
It's a tax that you don't know you pay. It's the tax you pay every time you get a gallon of gasoline. By the way, about 60 cents of every dollar that you buy in gas is tax. You don't know that. It doesn't say it anywhere.
It's a lot.
It's a big tax. Well, that's what they do here, is they put the tax on the production of things instead of on the sales side. So the tax gets passed on to you, but you don't know it. So where are they going to put these taxes? Well, look at these. Here's 5 things they're going to tax. First off, they're going to tax paper. Well, how many of you, think about it, how many colonists at that time period do you think went and just bought paper? Nobody went and just bought paper. But how much paper do you think they see every day? They go through it. They buy broadsheets. They're legal documents. Your life runs on an ocean of paper, and it's all been taxed. Now, it wasn't taxed directly. It was taxed by the person that bought it originally, and then they sold it to you and passed the tax on to you. So it's a hidden tax. You don't see it, but it's a big tax. Paint. Think paint's a big tax? Look around you. What doesn't have paint on it? Not a lot, right? Everything's painted. So you're basically, it's a way of taxing everything you make, okay? Because you paint everything. Lead.
Bullets.
Lead is in bullets. At that time period, it's what most silverware was made out of. By the way, glass. All glass was lead in glass back then. So your glass has got lead in it. Your silverware, your
Paying
dishes.
taxes for the lead and the glass.
Yes. So you're paying taxes on all this. And then they're actually going to tax glass again. So when you buy glass, you're getting taxed twice. And if you buy glass window panes, you're getting taxed on the glass, the lead, and the paint around it afterwards. You're getting taxed over and over again by this stuff. And then the tea tax comes back. By the way, the tea tax was also absolutely hated. This was a time period when most Americans drank tea. Coffee was not a big thing. By the way, the reason why we drink coffee today in America, nobody else in the world drinks a lot of coffee. Nobody does. You can get it, but coffee is just not a big drink. Everybody in the world drinks tea. We drink coffee. Why? Because the British pissed us off with the Tea Act. Okay? We said, we'll just do this. We'll just drink coffee. Okay? We did something a little different. The next thing they did is they passed a customs law where they increased the number of customs collectors. What's a customs collector?
Like specialized, like online?
No. Customs is a tax. It's a tax collector. It's somebody that's taxing the imports that are coming in. Everything that comes in gets taxed at American ports. But here's the deal. the tax collectors only got paid on what they could collect. They got paid a percentage of however much taxes they could collect. As a result, what do you think the tax collectors are going to do? They're going to seriously overtax. And in fact, they're going to be very corrupt and find you guilty of tax evasion very, very often. It increases their money. They don't get paid if you're found innocent. Okay? So it becomes that they become hated.
That's not, that was mixed up.
Did I get out of order?
Yeah.
All right, so what's the colonial response going to be? There's a fairly famous founding father named John. Try saying that 3 times fast. Famous founding father. Named John Dickinson from Pennsylvania. In 1768, John Dickinson wrote a great, I'm going to call it a letter. It really wasn't. It was an open letter. It was like an editorial. It was in a newspaper called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, where he laid out all of the taxes that were on him and put out the argument for Parliament abusing their power. I find this interesting because later on, John Dickinson is a member of the Continental Congress that votes for independence, and he is the sole person that refuses to sign the Declaration of Independence. He's a hero to me. He famously says that he will never stop hoping for reconciliation with England. But because I am a patriot, just as you, Mr. Franklin, are, speaking of Ben Franklin, because I'm a patriot just as you, Mr. Franklin, are, I will resign my position in Congress and join the Army. And John Dickinson goes off to fight the British himself. The second thing that happens in 1768 is Americans started what we call a non-importation movement. The non-importation movement was an organized policy of not buying goods because they were charging and taxing too much. Instead, we're going to start producing everything we need here. We're really bad at it. It's ran by the Daughters of Liberty, and the Daughters of Liberty started doing spinning bees. What do you think a spinning bee is? That's something you do in a workout studio, doesn't it? Spinning bee is where the women would get together and they would spin yarn and then make cloth and make fabric, make clothes and stuff for people. Massive amounts. Because there was no textile manufacturing, the women would just get together and they would have these massive spin-offs where they would create things. It's going to be pretty important. The anti-tax group, the Sons of Liberty, in Boston, they were led by a guy named John Hancock. John Hancock is a smuggler as well, and his ship, the Liberty, is actually taken by the British for a little while. 4,000 British troops were sent to Boston in order to control this anti-tax riot that's happening there. 4,000 troops. That's massive. And guess where they're living? In your homes. In your homes. All right. So why is this important? We're now getting into the age of revolution. For the first time, a new word is used. The people that joined the non-importation movement, the tax revolters, take a brand new name, and that name is Patriot. Patriot comes to mean someone that refuses to pay the taxes, and it doesn't yet mean independence, but it means someone who thinks that Americans are unique and they refuse to pay their taxes. All right, that gets us through this. Don't forget you've got that quiz. It's got to be done by Thursday.
It's really easy. I just did it.
It should be real simple to do. 16 questions? But I don't even know what the questions are. I haven't looked at it. Wednesday, we will do the Road to Revolution. That's already on your blackboard, so you should be able to get that done. And then I'm going to try and get a study guide out to you for the next test. All right? I will see y'all later. If you have any questions, I'll hang around for a minute. Yes?